Once again, I would like to welcome you to these studies in the Good News or the Gospel of Mark, the record, as we have seen, of the life of Jesus written by someone who knew him very well. Today we're considering together chapter 6 and verses 30 to the end of the same chapter. And here's what Mark says. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so the disciples came to him, saying, "This is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But Jesus answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, "5, and 2 fish." Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. Now the number of men who had eaten was 5,000. This is a familiar story to all of those of us who are remotely aware of the Bible's stories about Jesus. But as with all our previous studies, Mark expects us to reflect upon what he's telling us. And he's inviting us to ask, what is the significance of this story of the feeding of the 5,000 men and their families to those of us who are reading it now? One of the interesting things about Mark's account is that there is a shift of focus as we come to the end of chapter 6. Up to this point, Mark has been especially concerned to offer the evidence for his remarkable claim that Jesus was, as he put it in his introduction, the Messiah, the Son of God. But more recently in his account, greater attention has been given to the disciples, the little group of people who had started to gather around him as his followers. Increasingly, Jesus' training of them has come into focus, and this will continue in the following chapters. Jesus will continue, as in the present passage, to do remarkable things that point to who he is, but it's as if Mark wants to invite us to ask the further question: if Jesus is who he claims to be, what does that imply for me? So let's turn to the present passage. The juxtaposition of Herod's feast in the passage we studied last time and Jesus' feast here cannot surely be accidental. Nor can the allusions this passage seems to make to the messianic banquet which had been promised by God's earlier spokespersons be incidental to Mark's purpose. Simply, 2 kings are set opposite one another with a view to highlighting the nature of Jesus' kingship over us and showing how we should respond to him. The first thing that we notice is that Jesus' rule is compassionate, not selfish. Herod had acted selfishly throughout the previous story, But here Jesus acted because he had compassion on the needs of others. Then again, Jesus' rule is to be seen in the serving of others, not himself. Herod had used his power and resources to bring honour to, well, yes, to Herod. However, Jesus uses his power to serve the needs of those who had encountered him at an inconvenient moment, when he hoped for a richly deserved period of relaxation with his disciples. Finally, Jesus' rule is seen not in self-glorification, but in self-giving. This will become even clearer as Mark tells us his story, but here it's as if Mark wants us to see this as a model for all who follow Jesus, in every age, including us. Yet if we're thinking of following Jesus, we also need to be reminded of the sort of person he is, and for a different reason. Some of us sometimes have a very different picture of God than that presented to us in the Bible. But here Jesus, in whom Mark believes God is present with us, this Jesus is a gentle and compassionate king. He is a God unlike any other, a friend of the needy, always ready to meet us with generous compassion and grace. However, there are other aspects of being followers of Jesus that are mentioned here. In the earlier part of this chapter, the disciples had been sent out to represent Jesus and to teach and work on his behalf. The disciples had been commissioned, and success had followed. Here they report back to Jesus for a debrief. However, in Mark, all the detail of the report is passed over. Emphasis lies on Jesus' calling them away to a quiet place. We should not miss this. Jesus knows that those who follow him cannot keep on giving out. There needs time for rest and refreshment, to be with Jesus and to learn from him. And as the sequel shows, the disciples still had a lot of learning to do. Jesus, we learn, is not a heavy taskmaster. He won't place ever heavier burdens on our shoulders until we fall under the weight. There is a tender gentleness and awareness of our needs that is found in Jesus. But there seems to have been another reason that the report was passed over so briefly. Compare the reports in Matthew 10 and Luke 9, where this session with the disciples is given in greater detail. Jesus did not want the disciples to attach importance to what they did or to their success, rather than their relationship with him. Often in our world and even our religions, value is only given to successful, productive work. Often too we evaluate ourselves by the same standards, so that not only does our society or religion place burdens on us, but we add to these burdens by adopting the same viewpoint. But Mark wants us to understand that a disciple of Jesus will think very differently. It's their relationship to Jesus that is the only true standard of self-worth, whether successful or failures. It is Jesus' relationship with us that is the only satisfying basis for thinking about ourselves. However, we also notice that faithful discipleship is seen by a deepening understanding of God's ways in Jesus. The disciples had already experienced a great deal, but when challenged to provide a banquet with limited resources, they failed to apply what they knew and had experienced to a new situation. They needed more time with Jesus, and they needed time to think, as Jesus made very clear to them when at last they were able to spend some time together. Here then is a challenge to those who are considering stepping out on the path in fellowship with Jesus. And here is a similar challenge to those who, like the disciples, have already done so. Very simply, we will only get to know Jesus better if we spend time with him, our fellow travellers, and spend time listening to the testimonies about him. Above all, in the Bible. This will lead us to an ever-deepening experience of God, and this alone will help us to face new challenges. But we will not be alone. The gentle Jesus of whom Mark speaks here will be with us and will help chart the way and be attentive to our every need. He may be the king of the cosmos, but he cares, really cares, about each one of us. Look then, this is the God who invites you to get to know him better as king. Yes, but even more awesomely, to get to know him as a very dear friend.